The quiet panic. This is something you guys have been absolutely demanding for months now. You've been flooding my comments, blowing up my DMs, and trust me, I've been listening. It took me forever to track down these stories, but I finally managed to get my hands on 3 absolutely terrifying encounters that happened inside hotels. And let me tell you right now, after hearing these, you're going to think twice before booking that next weekend getaway. Picture this. You're exhausted after a long day of travel. You check into what seems like a perfectly normal hotel and you think you're finally going to get some rest. But what happens when the place you're supposed to feel safe becomes the source of your worst nightmare? What happens when the very walls that are meant to protect you become the stage for something so disturbing that it haunts you for years to come? By the end of this video, I'm going to share with you 3 stories that will make you question every hotel you've ever stayed in. These aren't just creepy tales or urban legends. These are real experiences from real people who thought they were just booking a room for the night, only to find themselves trapped in situations that defied all explanation. Now, before we dive into these spine-chilling encounters, let me tell you why these particular stories are different. I've spent weeks verifying these accounts, cross-referencing details, and I can tell you with complete confidence that what you're about to hear actually happened. These aren't Hollywood horror stories or campfire tales designed to scare you. These are genuine testimonies from people who lived through experiences that changed them forever. The first story takes place in a seemingly upscale hotel in the Midwest. Sarah was 24 years old, fresh out of college, and had just landed her dream job at a marketing firm 3 states away from home. She was driving cross-country to start her new life when exhaustion finally caught up with her somewhere in rural Ohio. It was getting dark, and Sarah knew she needed to find a place to stay for the night. She pulled off the highway and spotted what looked like a decent hotel. The building was older, probably built in the 70s, but it seemed clean and well-maintained from the outside. The parking lot was mostly empty, which she figured was normal for a Tuesday night in the middle of nowhere. Sarah walked into the lobby and immediately something felt off. The place was dead silent except for the humming of old fluorescent lights overhead. The carpet was that weird burgundy color that every hotel seemed to have back in the day. And there was this musty smell in the air that reminded her of her grandmother's basement. Behind the front desk sat an elderly woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she kept glancing toward the stairs that led to the upper floors. When Sarah approached to check in, the woman barely looked at her. She just slid a registration form across the counter and mumbled something about room 207 being available. Sarah filled out the paperwork and handed over her credit card. As the woman processed the payment, she finally looked up and made direct eye contact. That's when Sarah noticed something strange. The woman's hands were shaking, and she kept looking over Sarah's shoulder as if she was expecting someone to walk through the front door. "You stayin' just the one night?" the woman asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded and said she'd be checking out early in the morning to continue her drive. The woman handed her a key, and Sarah couldn't help but notice how cold her fingers were when they briefly touched during the exchange. "Room 207, the woman repeated, pointing toward the elevator. "Second floor, turn right, end of the hall. And miss, whatever you do, don't go wandering around the hotel after midnight. We've been having some maintenance issues." Sarah thought that was an odd thing to say, but she was too tired to think much about it. She grabbed her bag and headed to the elevator. The doors opened with a loud ding that echoed through the empty lobby, and she stepped inside. As the doors closed, she caught one last glimpse of the desk clerk, who was still staring at her with those worried eyes. The elevator ride to the second floor felt longer than it should have. The fluorescent light inside kept flickering, and there was this weird, grinding noise coming from somewhere above her head. When the doors finally opened, Sarah stepped out into a hallway that was dimly lit by wall sconces that cast strange shadows on the faded wallpaper. She turned right as instructed and walked down the hall toward room 207. The carpet was so thick that her footsteps were completely silent, which somehow made the whole experience even more unsettling. She passed several doors, each one identical to the next, until she reached the end of the hall. Room 207 was the last door on the right, just as the desk clerk had said. Sarah slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a loud creak, and she stepped inside to find a surprisingly spacious room with a queen-sized bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out over the parking lot. The room seemed normal enough, though it had that same musty smell she'd noticed in the lobby. Sarah set her bag on the bed and walked over to the window. She could see her car parked directly below, which made her feel a little better about the whole situation. At least she knew she could make a quick exit if she needed to. Sarah decided to take a shower before going to bed. The bathroom was small but clean, with white tile that looked like it had been recently scrubbed. She turned on the water and waited for it to warm up while she unpacked her toiletries. The water pressure was surprisingly good, and after a few minutes she was feeling more relaxed than she had all day. But as she was washing her hair, she heard something that made her freeze. It sounded like someone was walking around in the room next door. Heavy footsteps back and forth like someone pacing. She turned off the water and listened carefully. The footsteps continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Sarah finished her shower quickly and got dressed. She figured it was probably just another guest who couldn't sleep, nothing to worry about. She turned on the television to drown out any noise from neighboring rooms and settled into bed with her phone to check messages before going to sleep. That's when she noticed the time. It was 11:47. She remembered what the desk clerk had said about not wandering around after midnight, and she wondered what kind of maintenance issues could be so serious that guests needed to be warned about them. Sarah was exhausted, and despite the strange atmosphere of the hotel, she found herself drifting off to sleep. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the television playing some late-night talk show and the occasional car passing by on the highway outside. She woke up suddenly to complete darkness. The television had turned off, and the room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. Sarah reached for her phone to check the time, but the screen wouldn't turn on. She pressed the power button several times, but nothing happened. The battery had been at 60% when she went to sleep, so she knew it couldn't be dead. That's when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. Someone was trying to open her door, not knocking, not using a key, but actually trying to turn the handle and push the door open. The handle moved down slowly, then back up, then down again, as if someone was testing to see if it was locked. Sarah's heart started pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She lay perfectly still, hoping whoever was at the door would just go away. But the handle kept moving, slowly and deliberately, like someone was being very careful not to make noise. She wanted to call out and ask who was there, but something deep in her gut told her to stay quiet. The desk clerk's warning about not wandering around after midnight suddenly made a lot more sense. Sarah grabbed the blanket and pulled it up to her chin, as if that thin layer of fabric could somehow protect her from whatever was on the other side of that door. The handle stopped moving for a moment, and Sarah thought maybe whoever it was had given up. But then she heard something that made her stomach drop, a key sliding into the lock. Someone was unlocking her door from the outside. Sarah rolled out of bed as quietly as she could and crept toward the window. She could hear the key turning in the lock, metal scraping against metal in the darkness. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the window latch. But she managed to get it open just as she heard the door creak open behind her. She didn't turn around to see who had entered her room. Instead, she climbed out onto the fire escape and started making her way down to the parking lot. The metal stairs were freezing cold against her bare feet, and she could feel the rough texture cutting into her skin with each step. When she reached the ground, Sarah ran to her car and fumbled with her keys. She could see her hotel room window from where she stood, and there was a figure silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. Someone was definitely in her room, moving around, searching for something. Sarah got in her car and drove straight through the night, not stopping until she reached a 24-hour diner about 50 miles down the highway. She never found out who had entered her room that night, and she never went back to find out. The second story comes from Marcus, a traveling salesman who spent most of his time on the road visiting clients across the country. He'd stayed in hundreds of hotels over the years, so he thought he'd seen everything. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened during a business trip to Portland. Marcus had booked a room at what appeared to be a boutique hotel in the downtown area. The place had great reviews online, and the photos made it look modern and stylish. When he arrived, everything seemed perfectly normal. The lobby was sleek and contemporary, with polished marble floors and expensive-looking furniture. He checked in without any problems and took the elevator up to the 8th floor. His room was exactly what he'd expected based on the photos, clean and well-appointed with a view of the city skyline. Marcus unpacked his clothes, set up his laptop, and prepared for his meetings the next day. Around 10:30 that night, he decided to go down to the hotel bar for a drink before bed. The bar was on the 3rd floor, and when the elevator doors opened, Marcus stepped out into a hallway that looked completely different from the rest of the hotel. Instead of the modern decor he'd seen everywhere else, This hallway was decorated in an old-fashioned style with dark wood paneling and vintage light fixtures. The carpet was deep red with an intricate pattern that looked like it belonged in a mansion from the 1920s. Marcus thought it was interesting that the hotel had themed floors, and he followed the signs pointing toward the bar. But as he walked down the hallway, he noticed that all the room numbers were wrong. Instead of starting with 300 like they should have on the third floor, the numbers began with 200. He stopped at one of the doors and looked at the number more carefully. Room 213. That didn't make sense. He was definitely on the third floor. He'd pressed the button himself and watched the elevator display change from 1 to 2 to 3. Marcus decided to forget about the drink and head back to his room. But when he turned around to go back to the elevator, the hallway looked different. It seemed longer somehow. And there were more doors than he remembered seeing when he'd walked down it just a few minutes earlier. He started walking back toward where he thought the elevator should be. But every door he passed had a number in the 200s. 215, 217, 219. The numbers kept getting higher, but he was walking in the direction he'd come from, so they should have been getting lower. Marcus began to panic. He walked faster, checking each door as he passed. 221, 223, 225. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter how far he walked, he couldn't find the elevator. That's when he heard footsteps behind him. Someone else was in the hallway, walking in the same direction he was. Marcus turned around, expecting to see another hotel guest or maybe a staff member who could help him find his way back. But the hallway behind him was empty. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer, but there was nobody there. Marcus started running, checking every door he passed, looking for any way out of this impossible hallway. The footsteps behind him matched his pace, always staying just a few feet away but never getting closer. Finally, Marcus saw something that gave him hope. At the end of the hallway, there was a door marked with an exit sign. He ran toward it and pushed it open, expecting to find a stairwell that would take him back to the lobby. Instead, he found himself standing in the exact same hallway he'd just been running through. Same red carpet, same dark wood paneling, same vintage light fixtures. But now the room numbers started with 300 and the footsteps behind him had stopped. Marcus looked back through the door he'd just come through, and the hallway on the other side was gone. In its place was a brick wall, as if the door opened onto nothing at all. He spent the next 3 hours wandering through different versions of that same hallway, each one identical except for the room numbers. Sometimes they were in the 200s, sometimes the 300s, once even the 400s. But no matter which door he tried or which direction he walked, he couldn't find his way back to the elevator. Finally, around 2 in the morning, Marcus found himself standing in front of a door marked "Staff Only." He tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it opened easily. On the other side was a service elevator that took him directly down to the lobby. The next morning, Marcus asked the front desk about the 3rd floor and the bar that was supposed to be there. The clerk looked at him strangely and explained that the hotel only had 7 floors and there was no bar anywhere in the building. When Marcus insisted that he'd been on the third floor the night before, the clerk showed him the building directory. The third floor was completely dedicated to meeting rooms and conference facilities, all of which were locked after 9 p.m. Marcus checked out immediately and never stayed at that hotel again. To this day, he has no explanation for what happened to him that night. The final story takes place at a historic hotel in New England that's been operating since the 1800s. Emma was attending her college roommate's wedding and had booked a room for the weekend. The hotel was supposed to be charming and elegant, with a rich history and beautiful architecture. When Emma arrived, she was impressed by the grand lobby with its crystal chandeliers and marble staircase. The staff was friendly and professional, and her room on the fourth floor was beautifully decorated with antique furniture and period details. Everything was perfect until the second night of her stay. Emma had attended the wedding reception and returned to her room around midnight, tired but happy after celebrating with her friends. She changed into her pajamas and was getting ready for bed when she heard what sounded like a party going on in the room next door. There was music playing, people laughing and talking, the sound of glasses clinking together. Emma was annoyed because it was late and she was exhausted, but she figured it was probably other wedding guests continuing the celebration in their room. But as she listened more carefully, something about the music seemed off. It sounded old-fashioned, like something from the 1940s or 50s. And the voices had a strange quality to them, muffled and distant even though they seemed to be coming from right next door. Emma put her ear to the wall between her room and the neighboring one. The party sounds were definitely coming from there, but underneath the music and laughter, she could hear something else. A woman crying, sobbing quietly as if she was trying not to be heard. Emma decided to call the front desk to complain about the noise. But when she picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. She tried pressing different buttons, but the phone was completely dead. She checked her cell phone, but there was no signal. The party next door was getting louder, and now Emma could make out individual voices. Someone was singing along to the music, a man with a deep voice that seemed to echo strangely, and the woman was still crying, her sobs growing more desperate and heartbroken. Emma walked over to her door and looked through the peephole into the hallway. She could see the door to the room next door, but there was no light coming from underneath it. In fact, the entire hallway was dark except for the emergency lighting near the stairwell. She opened her door and stepped out into the hall. The party sounds immediately stopped, as if someone had turned off a radio. The hallway was completely silent, and when Emma put her ear to the neighboring door, she couldn't hear anything at all. Emma went back into her room, and within minutes the party started up again. Same music, same laughter, same woman crying. This went on for the rest of the night. Every time Emma left her room, the sounds would stop. Every time she went back inside, they would resume. The next morning, Emma asked the front desk about the guests in the room next to hers. The clerk checked the computer and told her that the room had been empty all weekend. In fact, it was undergoing renovation and wasn't available for booking. Emma insisted on seeing the room for herself. The clerk reluctantly agreed and accompanied her to the fourth floor with a master key. When they opened the door to the neighboring room, Emma saw that it was completely gutted. The walls had been stripped down to the studs, there was no flooring, and construction equipment was scattered throughout the space. There was no way anyone could have been staying in that room, let alone hosting a party. But Emma knew what she had heard, and she knew it had been coming from that exact location. The clerk mentioned that the room was being renovated because of its history. Apparently, back in 1953, a young couple had been staying there on their honeymoon when the husband discovered his new wife with another man. In a fit of rage, he had killed both of them before taking his own life. The hotel had tried to keep the story quiet over the years, but guests in neighboring rooms frequently reported strange sounds coming from that space. Party music from the 50s, a woman crying, and sometimes even arguments that would escalate into violence. Emma packed her bags and checked out that morning, cutting her weekend short. She never told her friend why she left the wedding early, but she still gets chills whenever she thinks about that night and the sounds that came from an empty, gutted room. These three stories remind us that sometimes the places we trust most to keep us safe can harbor secrets we never could have imagined. The next time you check into a hotel, remember Sarah, Marcus, and Emma, and maybe think twice before dismissing those strange sounds in the night as just your imagination.